This kill shouldn't have been possible. The US has just pulled off something using its HIMARS launchers that those weapons aren't supposed to be able to do, and Iran's Navy has felt the full force of this historic strike. This is a signal, one delivered to Iran, as well as the rest of the world, that the US military can do something that no other military has ever done before. What we've just seen is the US sinking Iranian ships using ballistic missiles fired from a launcher that is only supposed to be capable of hitting stationary targets. And this could change how the US fights naval battles forever. The War Zone, or TWZ, has the detail, as it reported on March 10th, that the US has been using its high-mobility artillery rocket systems, along with long-range ATACMS missiles, against Iran. This alone isn't newsworthy. HIMARS is a natural choice for fighting against Iran, not least because the regime has plenty of stationary targets on land for the US to hit. ATACMS is a good choice to hit those targets, so all of this makes sense. But we told you that there's a historic first involved, and that first is all down to another type of missile that HIMARS is firing at Iran, the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM. That brand new missile has made its official debut against Iran, and there are now questions about whether the US has developed an anti-ship variant. Why? We'll explain when we cover America's historic strike in a moment. First, we need to know a little bit more about the PrSM and why it could well be the missile that has enabled the US to pull off the impossible. Developed by Lockheed Martin, the PrSM is marketed as the next generation in our family of precision strike surface-to-surface weapon systems by the company. That should clue you into the fact this is a short-range ballistic missile that isn't supposed to be used against naval assets. Coming to a pod and launchable by HIMARS, the PrSM has a range that varies between 60 and 499 kilometers, or 37.2 and 310 miles, and it delivers an insensitive munition, or IM, energetic payload. That's notable for the simple reason that IM payloads are specifically designed for safety, as they are created to ensure that no external stimuli beyond that provided by the missile itself can cause the payload to explode. That's the concept, at least. Iran learned very quickly that an IM energetic payload that does what it's supposed to do is enough to sink ships. What the PrSM does, according to the Defense Post, is provide the US with the ability to quickly hit time-sensitive targets using mobile ground launchers such as HIMARS that it already has in the field. We know that the US has plenty of bases around Iran, so it's almost a given that HIMARS systems are located at these bases. All the US had to do was get its 816-kilogram or almost 1,800-pound missiles to where it needed them to be, and Iran would become a target for this new ballistic missile. We've seen plenty of evidence that the US has been rattling off missiles using its HIMARS launchers, and that it's using those launchers to fire PrSMs. US Central Command offered some evidence of that itself by sharing a video on X showcasing multiple PrSM launches from an undisclosed location. In a historic first, long-range precision strike missiles, PrSMs, were used in combat during Operation Epic Fury, providing an unrivaled deep strike capability, CENTCOM proclaimed, though it didn't provide much more information beyond showcasing a few launches. Another X account named Egypt's Intel Observer offered a little more with a video of a PrSM launch from a site in Bahrain, telling us that there is at least one location from which the US has been firing the missile. Bahrain just so happens to be within striking distance of the Iranian mainland. Perhaps more important, any missiles fired from the US base in that country would have to cross the Persian Gulf. What we've just seen is that a crossing may not have happened at all. Rather than hitting the Iranian mainland with its new ballistic missile, the US struck a ship. That's the impossible feat that goes along with the world's first usage of PrSM, and TWZ explains what happened. The outlet reached out to clarify comments made by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US Air Force, Dan Kane, who had said that the first 10 days of Operation Epic Fury has seen the US sink 50 of Iran's ships, using a combination of artillery, fighters, bombers, and sea-launched missiles. It's the mention of artillery that should perk up some ears here. When TWZ asked what that meant, the outlet received words from an unnamed US official who said that artillery referred to the use of HIMARS against Iranian Navy ships. That shouldn't be possible. That isn't what HIMARS is designed for. At least, it's not what ATACMS fired from HIMARS is designed to do, as TWZ explains. It should also be noted that there is no known operational variant of ATACMS capable of engaging moving targets, meaning it would have to be used against stationary ships, the outlet says. While it's certainly possible that the US hit a stationary ship using ATACMS, the limited range of ATACMS compared to PrSM makes that difficult. HIMARS itself also isn't great at hitting moving targets, as we've learned from the Ukraine war. Dr. Marina Miron, who is a war expert at the King's College London, explained when she spoke to the BBC about Ukraine's use of HIMARS launchers back in 2022. HIMARS is very accurate when it's used against fixed targets, when you have the exact coordinates, Miron said before adding, but it's not so effective against moving targets such as troops, so it cannot push back in advance. And yet Kane himself says that artillery was used against Iran's ships, and the official who spoke to TWZ has confirmed that this artillery was HIMARS. The evidence is starting to build up that the US pulled off something that it's never done before, a ballistic missile kill against a warship. The question we have to ask next is simple: how? There is a twist to the PrSM story that may give us the answer, but first let's apply Occam's razor for a moment and assume that the simplest explanation is the correct one. And the simplest explanation for America's ballistic missile kill is that it used HIMARS, likely with the standard version of PrSM, to strike a stationary ship while it was in port. The US has certainly taken this approach before. On March 2nd, TWZ reported that the US had struck one of Iran's major naval bases on the Strait of Hormuz, setting it ablaze and taking out at least one of Iran's frigates. A few days earlier, the same outlet had reported on another US strike against the docked Iranian Alvand-class frigate, which was shown in satellite images to be burning in Konarak, which is in Iran's southeast and sits on the Gulf of Oman. However, there was no confirmation of what struck these ships, and it's entirely possible that they were hit by US air power rather than the artillery that Kane mentions. The challenge here comes down to range. As Bahrain is the only location from which we can see confirmed HIMARS and PrSM launches, we can use that as an example. The shortest distance between Bahrain and Iran across the Persian Gulf is about 120 miles, TWZ explains. Both ATACMS and PrSM can cover that distance, but only a small portion of Iran would be within their ranges. When it comes to striking ships in port, the US is limited in its options. The Bandar Kangan and Asaluya ports would be within range, but not a whole lot else. Still, if Iran has been stationing warships at these ports, it's very possible that the US has hit those vessels using ballistic missiles to take them out of the equation. That's the simplest explanation for the world first that the US just pulled off. But what if there's another? What if the US has managed to score a kill against a moving Iranian warship using HIMARS and a PrSM ballistic missile? As insane as it sounds, there is a very good chance that this is precisely what has happened, and we're going to explain why in just a moment. Before we dig deeper into that, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button so you never miss a video. So we go from the probable to the seemingly impossible. How could the US strike a moving ship using one of its ballistic missiles? This is the sort of feat that is incredibly difficult to pull off at the best of times. Even with the standard PrSM, the US would have a hard time of hitting a moving ship. The clue is in what we just said. As fast as ballistic missiles are, they still have to travel hundreds of miles to reach their targets. Instant strikes aren't possible. So a target that is moving quickly, such as a ship, is a very difficult prospect. Throw that target into the seemingly endless blue of an ocean or sea, and you get even more challenges. Simply pinning down where a ship is and where it's going to be once a missile arrives is an immense challenge, and standard ballistic missiles aren't necessarily up for the task, at least not the missiles that are fired from HIMARS launchers. But the US may not have deployed a standard missile. The version of the PrSM that is used to strike one of Iran's warships may have been a special anti-ship variant that the US appears to have been developing for quite some time. Our evidence of this development comes from 2024. In June of that year, Naval News reported on the US having completed its first ever anti-ship ballistic missile sinking exercise, or SINK-X, and it used the PrSM to do it. In this exercise, the US used one of its autonomous multi-domain launchers and a pair of PrSM missiles to strike a decommissioned and moving ship as part of a training exercise called Valiant Shield. This exercise amounted to the first use of both these systems away from American soil, which was a first in its own right. But it's the fact that PrSM scored a hit that is the most significant milestone. A SINK-X hadn't been completed using a ballistic missile before. Now it had. And that means PrSM offers a weapon that the US can use to pull off similar feats almost 2 years later in the waters around Iran. TWZ adds that there is evidence that the US has been developing a version of PrSM that features an additional seeker known as Increment 2. There were rumblings of this being in the works in January 2024, 6 months before the successful SINK-X that used PrSM. The US had hailed the conclusion of the project that allowed for the creation of PrSM Increment 2 in 2023, TWZ reported at the time, and it was in the process of transforming a successful research project into the implementation of this new technology. The summer of 2024 use of a PrSM to sink a ship may well have also been the first example of the implementation of the Increment 2 technology bearing fruit. In other words, the US is using PrSM in Iran, but not as we might have assumed. However, there are a lot of unknowns in this equation, as TWZ explains. It's possible that the Army has begun to field Increment 2 PrSMs, at least on a limited level as well. The Army announced that it had begun initial flight testing of the new Seeker system in 2023. Whether or not Increment 1 missiles can be readily converted into Increment 2 versions is also unknown, the outlet says, adding that it's also very possible that the US fired the Increment 1 version of PrSM at a stationary ship. Still, there is one thing we know for certain. The US has pulled off at least one kill against an Iranian ship using HIMARS, and that kill was very likely conducted using a ballistic missile. Whether the ship was moving or not is almost immaterial, as this is still a world-first strike for the US, and it shows Iran that America has more options for taking out its warships than anybody ever thought possible. And that brings us to the reasons why this strike matters. Beyond the US pulling off something that it's never done before, which we'll cover in more detail later, what this strike means is that the US is another step closer to neutralizing Iran's navy. That is a key goal for the early days of Operation Epic Fury, not so much because Iran's navy presents a threat to the US naval power in the Persian Gulf region, but due to Iran's own piece of leverage being its control over the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow water artery is located to Iran's south, and about 20% of the world's seaborne oil and gas passes through it every year. In oil alone, that amounts to 20 million barrels daily, The Guardian reports, adding that the Strait of Hormuz is also the single most important trade route for super-chilled tankers carrying liquefied natural gas. Worse yet, this particular strait can't be circumvented easily, unlike other major waterways like the Strait of Malacca, which means that it's a choke point for a huge amount of the world's oil and gas. Hence, Iran has leverage. But that leverage can only be maintained if Iran has a functioning navy, which is what the US is trying to take away from it right now. Kane has claimed that the US has already destroyed around 50 of Iran's naval assets, which includes the ship the US is likely hit with its ballistic missile. However, as the New York Times points out, an extra complication comes from the fact that Iran's regime technically has two navies. The Islamic Republic of Iran Navy closely resembles the navies maintained by other countries, in the sense that it has conventional warships, the outlet says. However, there is a second navy, operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that uses smaller and faster boats, which patrol waterways like the Strait of Hormuz and can be used by Iran to conduct quick attacks that discourage the use of the strait. That's what the US is trying to tackle right now. Every strike against an Iranian ship, regardless of which of the two navies that ship belongs to, is a major win in terms of keeping oil and gas flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Open transit through the strait hasn't been reopened yet. Right now, experts like Quantum Strategies' David Roche expect the strait to reopen fully somewhere toward the end of March. But with each successful strike against an Iranian ship, that deadline starts to look a little more feasible. The US has also attacked Iranian ships that are attempting to lay mines in the strait, leading to 16 of these types of vessels being destroyed. Minesweepers will have to be deployed if those vessels were successful. What we have here is a tug of war over the Strait of Hormuz. The news that the US can now hit ships using ballistic missiles creates yet another problem for Iran in a naval war that it's clearly losing. Let's come back to the reason why the US using a ballistic missile to take out a ship is so important on a wider level. As TWZ points out, the US military has been trying to play catch-up in the anti-ship ballistic missile race for quite some time. China has made massive investments into this arena, which has led to the development of weapons such as the KD-21, which is an air-launched ballistic missile that could theoretically strike ships. However, theoretically is the key word there. China hasn't been involved in a major war for decades, and the modernized version of its military is almost completely untested. What the US has just done with its anti-ship ballistic missile strike is do away with theory and conjecture entirely. America has proven that it has a version of the PrSM that can hit ships. Whether docked or at sea, the simple fact that it has happened in a real combat situation has taken the US from trying to play catch-up to becoming the world leader in this arena, simply by virtue of it being the only country that has made this type of strike happen. That is a signal, not just to Iran, but as TWZ explains, to any other country that might find itself engaged in a conflict with the US in the future. PrSM is often discussed as a particularly important new capability in the context of any future high-end fight against China in the Pacific, just on account of its extended range compared to ATACMS, the outlet says, adding, that extra reach will be valuable for engaging targets on land and at sea. What all of this means is that PrSM is not only active, but it has experienced its first true combat tests, and it's passing them all with flying colors. It's almost certain that the US has been firing these new ballistic missiles at targets on the Iranian mainland. But if TWZ is right about what Kane means when he says that the US has taken out Iranian naval assets using artillery, then PrSM is an even greater proven threat to the likes of China and Russia. The US can take out ships with ballistic missiles, and that gives America a capability that could be very important, not just in Iran, but in any future conflict. China should be especially worried about this new capability, especially when it comes to the aircraft carriers that the country has invested so heavily in building. The Fujian-class carrier is supposed to represent progress, but the reality is that it could be taken out by a US warship built in the 1970s. Never mind the ballistic missiles that the US is now capable of launching at it. Check out our video if you want to learn more, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the Military Show so you don't miss any of our coverage of the Iran war. And thank you as always for watching.